Yo guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to go ahead and dive into the Season 28 Water Ally Ina's Monk for speed farming GRs. I wouldn't say this build is as strong as the LoD Wave of Light Monk, however it's a lot easier to gear this out, and so it's a great place to start to build your way up to that LoD Monk. With fairly decent gear, this build can absolutely mow through GR 115s, and in the right map, it can definitely do 120s. I'm sure that if you got better gear and you optimize your rolls, you could probably even get up to 125 with it. At the end of the video, I'm going to go ahead and put up footage of a speed run of a 115 as well as a 120 so that you can see it in action in each difficulty. But let's go ahead and start by diving in with the skills. For the primary skill, we're going to be using Way of the 100 Fists with Blazing Fists. This is really nice because it'll give us both movement speed as well as attack speed. We'll also be using Cyclone Strike with Implosion. This is really nice because we have an item in the cube that basically increases the damage of our water ally when we use Cyclone Strike. This also pulls all enemies within 34 yards to your location. Both of these two skills are also going to work with Epiphany and allow us to teleport from pack to pack while Epiphany is active so that we can save charges on our dash. Next up, we're going to be using Mystic Ally with Water Ally. This is what the build is all about. It basically turns all of your allies into these crashing waves that devastate everything in their path. With the version of the build that we're going to be playing, you're pretty much just going to want to be popping this every single time that it's up. We're going to be resetting our cooldowns very quickly. We're not even using that much cooldown reduction on our gear because we have other ways of getting this cooldown reset. Next up, we'll be using Dashing Strike with Radiance. Gain 15% increased attack speed for 4 seconds after using Dashing Strike. There is an alternative option to this if you would like. You could also go with Quicksilver just to increase the maximum stacks to 3. So I would say test them both out and go with whichever one you find works best for your playstyle. Next up, we'll be using Serenity with Ascension. This is going to give us immunity, and on top of that, it's going to protect our Squirt's Necklace, which is probably the most important thing that it does. We're also going to be resetting the cooldown on this all the time, and so you're going to have pretty good uptime on your immunity. Last up, we'll be using Epiphany with Desert Shroud. In a good map, you can keep this up 100% of the time. Fantastic skill, allows us to use these abilities up here to actually teleport to enemies. While Epiphany is active, if you use either one of these skills on an enemy, it'll effectively use a dash to get to those enemies. Although this can be really convenient at times, it can also be a little frustrating at times when you're trying to stand in like an Oculus ring circle, for example, and you're also trying to use your skills up here, and you keep teleporting out of that Oculus ring. But all in all, it definitely keeps us going quickly. Moving on to the passive skills, we're going to start with Seize the Initiative. Dealing damage to enemies above 75% life increases our attack speed. Next up, we're going to be taking Relentless Assault. This build is freezing enemies constantly, and so you're going to have really good uptime on this 20% damage increase. We'll also be taking Determination. Each enemy within 12 yards increases our damage by 4%, up to a maximum of 20. And lastly, we'll be taking Beacon of Ytar to reduce our cooldowns. Moving along to the gear, as I had mentioned earlier, I don't exactly have optimized gear for this build, and yet it still performs very well. We're going to go ahead and start with the helm. You're going to want to take Dexterity, Resist All Elements, or Vitality, Crit Chance, and a socket with a diamond in it. One thing I'd like to note about Resist All Elements is that it's absolutely okay to roll this in the place of Vitality because we can use some of our Paragon points to supplement our Vitality. Just make sure that you're getting up to at least 800,000 life. This build is a little bit squishy, and so if it makes you feel a little bit more comfortable, feel free to even use Paragon points to get up to about 1,000,000 life. Next up is the shoulders, and we're going to go with the Oghild set. We are using a Ring of Royal Grandeur in the cube, and so we do benefit from the 3-piece bonus. We're going to want Dexterity, Vitality, cooldown reduction, and Mystic Ally damage. For the amulet, we're going to take Squirt's Necklace, cold damage, crit, and a socket. You're absolutely going to want to use the Enforcer gem with this build. For the chest, we're going to take Ina's Dexterity, Vitality, or Resist All Elements will do just fine. Mystic Ally damage, and 3 sockets with diamonds in them. For the gloves, we're going to take Frostburns, and this is going to keep enemies frozen. As we had covered earlier in our passives, we're going to deal 20% more damage to enemies that are frozen. This is how we're freezing enemies, and it's also going to activate our Bane of the Trapped. So the stats that you're going to want to take are Dexterity, Attack Speed, crit hit chance, and crit hit damage. Of course, you'll want to get that secondary roll as high as you can. It rolls from 15 to 20, so try to either get 20 or as close as you can to it. For the bracers, we're going to take Og Hills. You'll want cold damage, dexterity, vitality, and crit hit chance. For the belt, we're doing Ina's again. Dexterity, vitality, all resist, and 15% life are going to be the stats you want to take. Moving on to the rings, we are going to take focus and our strength in this build. Ideally, you're going to want average damage, crit, socket, and I would definitely recommend using Bane of the Trapped in this build. I will note that if you can't roll average damage on both of the rings, that's absolutely okay. Dexterity will work just fine. Just make sure that you get the crit hit chance, crit damage, and a socket. For the legendary gem, you can either go with Molten Will to be Skizzard to protect your Squirt's necklace when Serenity is not up. Alternatively, you could go with Bane of the Powerful for more raw damage. If you're somebody who's watching Netflix on your second screen, I would definitely recommend going with Molten Will to be Skizzard, but if you're really focused and really paying attention, Bane of the Powerful probably has higher potential. For the pants, we'll be using Ina's again. Dexterity, Vitality, all resist, and 2 sockets with diamonds in them will be the stats you want. We'll also be taking the crudest boots in this build. You'll want Dexterity, Vitality, Armor, and all resist. You're not going to want movement speed on these. The only reason I'm keeping these is because I got a 199% roll on the secondary. Just make sure that you're getting that as close to 200 as you can. For the weapon, we're going with Ina's Reach. You'll want 10% damage, dexterity, attack speed. It will always roll with the Mystic Ally damage. It can go all the way up to 120%, so try to get it as close to that as possible. Of course, you'll use a Ramalandi's Gift. To add a socket to this, I would definitely recommend going with an Emerald. Alright, moving over here so that we can cover the cube, we're going to want to take Messerschmitt's Reaver. Reduce the remaining cooldown of one of your skills by 1 second when you slay an enemy. As an alternative to Messerschmitt's, you could go with Ingeom. Personally, I don't like this as much. It's very inconsistent when you can't find elite packs, and you really slow down when you're not reducing your cooldowns. Messerschmitt's is pretty much working 100% of the time, which is why I like to take it. The density and rifts is typically good enough to make this feel very good. For the armor slot, we're going to take Bindings of the Lesser Gods. Enemies hit by your Cyclone Strike take 200% increased damage from Mystic Ally. And lastly, we'll be using the Ring of Royal Grandeur so that we can benefit from the Og Hills as well as the Inas. For the follower, you can either go with the Enchantress or the Scoundrel. If you're playing the Ingeom variant, I would definitely recommend going with the Enchantress to reduce your cooldowns. The problem with Ingeom is when you do not have an elite pack and you cannot get that buff, it can become pretty difficult to manage your cooldowns. However, in the Messerschmitt's variant, the Scoundrel does just fine. But if you still want the additional cooldown while you're playing the Messerschmitt's version, absolutely feel free to go with the Enchantress. I do recommend that you try to get your follower geared out enough to use this token that gains access to all skills, as opposed to the one that prevents them from dying. A properly geared follower is not going to be dying in these speed GRs, and so it's absolutely worth it to take some time to augment your followers' gear, get their stats up very high so that they're not dying, to allow you to use this token. But if your follower is not quite there yet, definitely go with the token that's going to keep them alive. Just make sure that you're getting the essential items, including the Flavor of Time, Nemesis Bracers, Oculus Ring, and the Gloves of Worship. One thing that I will note about your follower is that when you're augmenting their gear, go ahead and use Intelligence if you're using either the Templar or the Scoundrel. If you're using the Enchantress, use Strength or Dexterity. This seems a little bit counterintuitive, but it actually adds resist all elements to the Scoundrel, which is going to keep him a lot tougher than just adding Vitality as an augment. The gameplay for this build is pretty straightforward. You're pretty much just going to dash into a pack, group them all up with Cyclone Strike, and then use Mystic Ally to wipe everything out. Your cooldowns are going to be constantly resetting themselves incredibly quickly, especially dash. This is just going to keep resetting each time you dash forward because your Mystic Allies are going to wipe out everything. This allows you to keep dashing forward and forward and forward without any problems. With enough monster density, you should have about 100% uptime on the Epiphany. If you get a GR that's not quite as good, which definitely happens sometimes, you'll probably only have about 90% uptime on it, but we still have great mobility with Dashing Strike, and so it's nothing to worry about. Well guys, that just about does it. I'm going to go ahead and put up some GRs. I'm going to start with a GR 115, and then I'll put up a GR 120 that I cleared earlier, just so that you guys can see this in action. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for stopping in, and I'll catch you on the next one.